Welcome again to another episode of the Washington SXM podcast. As always, like, share, comment, and subscribe. Don't forget to click that bell to get notified whenever I drop a video. So, I'm gonna do a video tonight on my country, Jamaica. It's a video of the summary of Jamaica. It won't go in depth, but it will give you a general idea how Jamaica came about and what happened. So, let's get into the hit. And also, why Jamaica and Ghana is so intertwined.
The Caribbean island of Jamaica was initially inhabited in approximately 600 AD or 650 AD by the Red Ware people, often associated with Red Ware pottery.
Arawaks.
However, some of the Taino escaped into the forested mountains of the interior, where they mixed with runaway African slaves and survived free from first Spanish and then English rule.
True.
Some African slaves took advantage of the political turmoil and escaped to the island's interior mountains, forming independent communities which became known as the Maroons. Meanwhile, on the coast, the English built the settlement of Port Royal, a base of operations where piracy flourished as so many European rebels had been rejected from their countries to serve sentences on the seas. Enslaved Jamaicans mounted over a dozen major uprisings during the 18th century, including Takis Revolt in 1760.
Around that time.
There were also periodic skirmishes between the British and the mounting communities of the Jamaican Maroons, culminating in the First Maroon War of the 1730s and the Second Maroon War of...
Stick up in. It's rumored that the Maroon came from Ghana. So that's why we are so intertwined, Jamaica and Ghana. That's why we have the travel to Ghana for Jamaicans on the passport. I found this out recently.
1795 to 1796. Pre-Columbian Jamaica, the first inhabitants of Jamaica probably came from islands to the east in two waves of migration. Alligator Pond in Manchester Parish and Little River in St. Ann Parish are among the earliest known sites of this Osteonoid person, who lived near the coast and extensively hunted turtles and fish. Around 800 CE, the Arawak tribes of the Tainos arrived, eventually settling throughout the island.
Facts. Arawak was the first.
To add nutrients to the soil, the Arawak burned local bushes and trees and heaped the ash into large mounds, into which they then planted yucca cuttings. Most Arawak lived in large circular buildings, bohayos, constructed with wooden poles, woven straw, and palm leaves. Some of the words used by them, such as barbacoa, barbecue, hamaka, hammock, canoa, canoe, tobacco, yucca, batata, sweet potato, and huracan, hurricane, have been incorporated into Spanish and English. The Spanish colonial period, 1494 to 1655, Christopher Columbus is believed to be the first European to reach Jamaica.
Facts.
He landed on the island on the 5th of May 1494, during his second voyage to the Americas.
Stick up in. When Christopher came, Christopher come Jamaica. He wasn't. He was the first European, yes, but he when he came here, he found the Arawaks, and at that time, a side note, Arawaks, they used to worship the moon. They have the moon as a god. So when he came, he said that he gonna take the moon from them if they don't. First, he was trying to run amok, so they didn't have no food, no water, and they couldn't go ashore because they was afraid of them. And then he found out they worship the moon, so because they were gonna have an eclipse, he tell them he gonna take the moon from them if they don't give him water, food, and shelter. And the eclipse came. They come and they bow down to him because they think he was a god or he was a thief. And as it comes, he end up steal all them trees, fruit trees, and bring back to Spain, and all what the Arawaks had then, and that's why I'm saying he's a rapist, he's a murderer, and he's an enslaver. So he's like 3 in 1. He's like he's an evil guy. I don't see why they have a Columbus Day, because it makes no sense. Let's continue.
Had been sailing around the Caribbean for nearly a year when a storm beached his ships in St. Anne's Bay, Jamaica, on the 25th of June 1503. Columbus and his men remained stranded on the island for 1 year, finally departing on June 1504. The Spanish crown granted the island to the Columbus family, but for decades it was something of a backwater, valued chiefly as a supply base for food and animal hides. In 1509, Juan de Esquivel founded the first permanent European settlement, the town of Sevilla la Nueva, New Seville, on the north coast of the island. A decade later, Friar Bartolomé de las Casas wrote to Spanish authorities about Esquivel's conduct during the Higi massacre of 1503. In 1534 the capital was moved to Villa de la Vega, later Santiago de la Vega, now called Spanish Town. This settlement served as the capital of both Spanish and English Jamaica from its founding until 1872, after which the capital was moved to Kingston. By the early 17th century, when most of the Taino had died out, the population of the island was about 3,000, including a small number of African slaves. Disappointed in the lack of gold on the island, Jamaica was mainly used as a military base to supply colonization efforts in the mainland Americas. The Spanish colonists did not bring women in the first expeditions and took Taino women for their common-law wives, resulting in mestizo children. Although the Taino referred to the island as Jamaica, the Spanish gradually changed the name to Jamaica. In the so-called Admiral's Map of 1507 the island was labelled as Jamaica, and in Peter Martyr's work Decades of 1511, he referred to it as both Jamaica and Jamaica. English conquest. In late 1654, English leader Oliver Cromwell launched the Western Design Armada against Spain's colonies in the Caribbean. After the Spanish repelled this poorly executed attack, the English force then sailed for Jamaica, the only Spanish West Indies island that did not have new defensive works. In May 1655, around 7,000 English soldiers landed near Jamaica's capital, named Spanish Town, and soon overwhelmed the small number of Spanish troops. At the time, Jamaica's entire population only numbered around 2,500. In 1660, the turning point was when some Spanish runaway slaves, who settled in the interior mountainous regions of Jamaica, became known as the Jamaican Maroons. Under the leadership of Juan de Bola switched sides from the Spanish to the English. British colonization. Cromwell increased the island's European population by sending indentured servants and prisoners to Jamaica. Although the African slave population in the 1670s and 1680s never exceeded 10,000, by the end of the 17th century imports of slaves increased the black population to at least 5 times greater than the white population. Thereafter, Jamaica's African population did not increase significantly in number until well into the 18th century, in part because ships coming from the west coast of Africa preferred to unload at the islands of the Eastern Caribbean. Maroons. When the English captured Jamaica in 1655, the Spanish colonists fled, leaving a large number of African slaves. These Jamaican Maroons intermarried with the Arawak people and established distinct independent communities in the mountainous interior of Jamaica. In the second half of the 17th century, de Serres fought regular campaigns against English colonial forces, even attacking the capital.
Stick up in, because the Maroons, as I've understood, came from Ghana. I don't know, yeah, they did, but that's mean the English brought them there, not the Spanish.
Spanish Town, and he was never defeated by the English. Throughout the 17th century, and in the first few decades of the 18th century, Maroon forces frequently defeated the British in small-scale skirmishes. The British colonial authorities dispatched numerous expeditions in an attempt to subdue them, but the Maroons successfully fought a guerrilla campaign against the British in the mountainous interior, and forced the British government to seek peace terms to end the expensive conflict.
Stick up in, because we studied this in school. That's why Jamaicans in general, we know our history, because this is what one thing is taught in school is Jamaican history. So I remember that when the Maroons fight off the British, because the Maroons was barefooted, and they went to the mountains and the hills where it's muddy and slippery, and the English had on shoes, and so they wasn't good enough to climb those hills, and that's why the Maroons end up escape. And it's a debate up to today if Nanny, the Maroon, she's a Jamaica, the first Jamaica female hero, it's debatable if when she came to Jamaica if she was a slave, but some say she was a princess, like a queen. Princess. It's because she bring her own slave. And then you have a next set saying that she was a slave that got away and went up in the hills. So it's debatable at this point, but the fact will remain, she was the leader of the Maroons for a couple of years, before she died, when she was 47, when she passed.
Early 18th century, English-speaking escaped Akan slaves were at the forefront of the Maroon fighting against the British. The House of Assembly, beginning with the Stuart monarchy's appointment of a civil governor to Jamaica in 1661, political patterns were established that lasted well into the 20th century. The second governor, Lord Windsor, brought with him in 1662 a proclamation from the king giving Jamaica's non-slave populace the same rights as those of English citizens, including the right to make their own laws. Although he spent only 10 weeks in Jamaica, Lord Windsor laid the foundations of a governing system that was to last for 2 centuries, a crown-appointed governor acting with the advice of a nominated council in the legislature. After the Duke's death in 1688, the planters, who had fled Jamaica to London, succeeded in lobbying James II to order a return to the pre-Albemarle political arrangement, the local control of Jamaican planters belonging to the Assembly. Jamaica's pirates, following the 1655 Conquest, Spain repeatedly attempted to recapture Jamaica. In response, in 1657, Governor Edward d'Oyley invited the Brethren of the Coast to come to Port Royal and make it their home port. The Brethren was made up of a group of pirates who were descendants of cattle-hunting buccaneers, later anglicized to buccaneers, who had turned to piracy after being robbed by the Spanish, and subsequently thrown out of Hispaniola. These pirates concentrated their attacks on Spanish shipping, whose interests were considered the major threat to the town. Around the same time that pirates were invited to Port Royal, England launched a series of attacks against Spanish shipping vessels and coastal towns. By sending the newly appointed privateers after Spanish ships and settlements, England had successfully set up a system of defense for Port Royal. Jamaica became a haven of privateers, buccaneers, and occasionally outright pirates, Christopher Myngs, Edward Mansvelt, and most famously, Henry Morgan. As a result, the sugar monoculture and slave work plantation society spread across Jamaica throughout the 18th century, decreasing Jamaica's dependence on privateers for protection and funds. However, the English colonial authorities continued to have difficulty suppressing the Spanish Maroons, who made their homes in the mountainous interior and mounted periodic raids on estates and towns, such as Spanish towns. The Carmahally Maroons, led by Juan de Serres, continued to stay in the forested mountains and periodically fought the English. In the 1670s and 1680s, in his capacity as an owner of a large slave plantation, Morgan led 3 campaigns against the Jamaican Maroons of Juan de Serres. After the earthquake, the town was partially rebuilt, but the colonial government was relocated to Spanish Town, which had been the capital under Spanish rule. Jamaica's sugar boom. In the mid-17th century, sugarcane was introduced to the British West Indies by the Dutch from Brazil. Upon landing in Jamaica and other islands, they quickly urged local growers to change their main crops from cotton and tobacco to sugarcane. With depressed prices of cotton and tobacco, due mainly to stiff competition from the North American colonies, the farmers switched, leading to a boom in the Caribbean economies. By 1832, the median-sized plantation in Jamaica had about 150 slaves, and nearly one of every...
Stick up in. I'm leaving it run because I want people who don't have knowledge of Jamaica to get some insight into my culture, where we're coming from to where we are now. So that's why I'm just leaving it play, so bear with me.
4 bondsmen lived on units that had at least 250 slaves. After slavery was abolished in 1834, sugarcane plantations used a variety of forms of labor, including workers imported from India under contracts of indenture. First Maroon War. Starting in the late 17th century, there were periodic skirmishes between the English colonial militia and the Windward Maroons, alongside occasional slave revolts. Notably, in 1690 a revolt at Sutton's plantation in Clarendon Parish of 400 slaves considerably strengthened the Leeward Maroons. The Leeward Maroons inhabited cockpits, caves, or deep ravines that were easily defended, even against troops with superior firepower.
Facts, because the Maroons was great warriors.
The use of scouts who blew the abeng, the cow horn, which was used as a trumpet to warn of approaching enemies, allowed the Maroons to evade, thwart, frustrate, and defeat the British.
Barefoot, no shirt.
Early in the 18th century, the Maroons took a heavy toll on British colonial militiamen who sent against them in the interior, in what came to be known as the First Maroon War. However, despite increased numbers, the British colonial authorities were unable to defeat the Windward Maroons. In 1739-40, the British government in Jamaica recognized that it could not defeat the Maroons, so they offered them treaties of peace instead. In 1739, the British, led by Governor Edward Trelawney, sued for peace with the Leeward Maroon leader, Cudjoe, described by British planters as a short, almost dwarf-like man who for years fought skillfully and bravely to maintain his people's independence. This last
Facts.
clause in the treaty naturally caused a split between the Maroons and the mainly mulatto population, although from time to time runaways from the plantations still found their way into Maroon settlements, such as those led by Three-Fingered Jack, Jamaica.
Stick a pin. A quick footnote. The treaty that was signed in the 17th century it's still a debate up to today because some people didn't agree with it, but you can't use modern time thinking and look back into 17th century and say you would do this and you wouldn't do that. Yes, the Maroons had to sign a treaty with the English, and they have to return. The Maroons were free and they have their own land, they have their own laws, they have their own leaders. But in that document they signed, it state any runaway slave they have to return them. But me personally, I don't think they return all. I think they return some, but you have to choose choose what you want. You want the English to leave you alone, give you land and property, or you have to return a few slaves. So I think I'm with the Maroons on this. Returning a few slaves to safeguard the freedom of hundreds of others than just returning a few slaves. So yeah.
A year later, the even more rebellious Windward Maroons led by Quayo also agreed to sign a treaty under pressure from both white Jamaican militias and the Leeward Maroons. The Maroons were to remain in their 5 main towns, Accompong, Cudjoe's Town, Trelawney Town, Nanny Town, later known as Moore Town, Scots Hall, Jamaica, and Charlestown, Jamaica, living under their own rulers and a British supervisor.
Yeah, fuck, I just said that.
Tacky's revolt in May 1760, Tacky, a slave overseer on the frontier plantation in St. Mary Parish, led a group of enslaved Africans in taking over the frontier and Trinity plantations while killing their enslavers.
Yeah,
After killing the
I remember
storekeeper, Tacky and his men stole nearly 4 barrels of gunpowder and 40 firearms with shot before marching on to overrun the plantations at Haywood Hall and Esher. Soon there were
Jamaicans have always been
mounted
rebellious
militia on their way along with some Maroons from Scots Hall, who were bound by treaty to suppress such rebellions. When the militia learned of the Obeeman's boast of not being able to be killed, an Obeeman was captured, killed, and hung with his mask, ornaments of teeth and bone, and feather trimmings at a prominent place visible from the encampment of rebels. Tacky and his men went running through the woods being chased by the Maroons and their legendary marksman, Davy the Maroon. While running at full speed, Davy shot Tacky and cut off his head as evidence of his feat, for which he would be richly rewarded. The rest of Tacky's men were found in a cave near Tacky Falls, having committed suicide rather than going back to slavery. Second Maroon War. In 1795, the Second Maroon War was instigated when 2 Maroons were flogged by a black slave for allegedly stealing 2 pigs. This sparked an 8-month conflict, spurred by the fact that Maroons felt that they were being mistreated under the terms of Cudjoe's Treaty of 1739, which ended the First Maroon War. The British colonial authorities could muster 5,000 men, outnumbering the Maroons 10 to 1, but the mountainous and forested topography of Jamaica proved ideal for guerrilla warfare. A treaty signed in December between Major General George Walpole and the Maroon leaders established that the Maroons would beg on their knees for the King's forgiveness, return all runaway slaves, and be relocated elsewhere in Jamaica. After a few years, the Maroons were again deported to the new British settlement of Sierra Leone in West Africa. Slave resistance.
Stick up in is not all. It's the slave they had, they returned back, but not the Maroons, because they had no control over the Maroon. They couldn't capture them, they couldn't kill them, they couldn't enslave them. So they had to sign a treaty with them twice to leave them be, because the English was suffering too much defeat, they were suffering huge losses of soldiers. So hence the reason why they had to leave the Maroons alone. Because they used the Jamaica, the mountains and the hills as their cover, which the English had no knowledge of.
Hundreds of runaway slaves secured their freedom by escaping and fighting alongside the Maroons of Trelawney Town. In 1798, a slave named Cuffy ran away from a western estate and established a runaway community which was able to resist attempts by the colonial forces and the Maroons remaining in Jamaica to subdue them. In the early 19th century, colonial records describe hundreds of runaway slaves escaping to Healthshire, where they flourished for several years before they were captured by a party of Maroons. In 1812, a community of runaways started when a dozen men and some women escaped from the sugar plantations of Trelawney into the Cockpit country, and they created a village with the curious name of Minnow Senunokam. Minosenunocum also conducted a thriving trade with slaves from the north coast, who exchanged their salt provisions with the runaways for their ground provisions. The Baptist War, in 1831, enslaved Baptist preacher Samuel Sharp led a strike among demanding more freedom and a working wage of half the going wage rate. Upon refusal of their demands, the strike escalated into a full rebellion, in part because Sharp had also made military preparations with a rebel military group known as the Black Regiment led by a slave known as Colonel Johnson of Retrieve Estate, about 150 strong with 50 guns among them. The militia retreated to Montego Bay while the Black Regiment advanced an invasion of estates in the hills, inviting more slaves to join while burning houses, fields, and other properties, setting off a trail of fires through the Great River Valley in Westmoreland and St. Elizabeth to St. James.
My parish, Westmoreland.
The Baptist War, as it was known, became the largest slave uprising in the British West Indies, lasting 10 days and mobilized as many as 60,000 of Jamaica's 300,000 slaves. Approximately 500 slaves were killed in total, 207 during the revolt, and somewhere in the range between 310 and 340 slaves were killed through various forms of judicial executions after the rebellion was concluded, at times, for quite minor offences. One recorded execution indicates the crime being the theft of a pig, another, a cow. Emancipation. The British Parliament held 2 inquiries as a result of the loss of property and life in the 1831 Baptist War Rebellion. Their reports of the conditions of the slaves contributed greatly to the abolition movement and helped lead to the passage of the Slavery Abolition Act of 1833, formally ending slavery in Jamaica on August 1, 1834. However, the act stipulated that all slaves above the age of 6 on the date abolition took effect were bound, indentured, in service to their former owners, albeit with a guarantee of rights, under what was called the apprenticeship system. By 1839, £20 million was paid out to the owners of slaves freed in the Caribbean and Africa under the 1833 Abolition Act, half of whom were absentee landlords residing in Great Britain. With the abolition of the slave trade in 1808 and slavery itself in 1834, the island's sugar and slave-based economy faltered. But no.
We're gonna stop there for now because it's but I hope y'all get a touch of history of how Jamaica was, from how long it has been inhabited by Arawaks and Africans and natives up to today. Well, not up to today, but you get an idea of the wars we fought, why Jamaica was stand out so much in the Caribbean, because of we put up, well, not Jamaican, the Jamaicans then, which includes the Maroons and those Arawaks and the Caribs as well. They give the enslavers a big fight. The English, the Spain, they end up after us sign multiple treaties and just leave the Maroons alone. Hence, up to today, the Maroons still exist. They have the Maroon town. They have a whole area for themselves. So it's still there in Jamaica. So hope y'all get some knowledge and some history about my culture, Jamaica, and how far it's coming from. Okay? I will do a part 1 on it soon, when I get a chance, but anyway. Don't know what it is. It's the Washington SXM podcast as always. Like, share, comment, and subscribe. You don't know. Peace, one love. Boom.